the police took over, kicking the door down and switching on the light. The horror before us would be something that would never leave my mind.
Last January, I was working as an associate at the Walmart over in Lake Charles. I was working second shift, so that's 1 p.m. to 10 p.m., and it was about 7 p.m. when people started to notice some kind of drama going off in the parking lot. The greeter noticed it first and was actually getting ready to have someone call the cops, but the whole thing seemed to die down, and then, from what I heard, things sort of just chilled out. I asked a coworker if anything juicy had happened, and she said no, but that the drama was between two groups of teenage girls and that one of the groups had walked into the store. They weren't being loud or obnoxious or anything, not at first anyway. They were just walking up and down the aisles talking among themselves, and one of the girls seemed to be making a video of them just hanging out. I remember hearing one of the girls saying something like, "Man, I need my taser back." But I just put that down to them talking smack after almost getting into a fight or something. The other thing I know is that loss prevention was watching them after one of them seemed to take something out of the kitchen utensils section, but they were just keeping their distance and observing until they tried to make an exit for the store. This is actually super relevant to what happened later on too, so keep it in mind. Anyways, I went back to what I was doing. Then the next thing I know, there's all kinds of screaming coming from near the front section of the store. I walked around to see what was going on, and that's when I see a group of girls in the doorway, shouting at the group that was inside. They were all saying all this stuff like, "Where y'all at? Come out." They knew the other group had walked inside the Walmart and were obviously trying to find them. The greeter was trying to get them to calm down or leave, saying they could either stop making a scene or was going to call the cops, but neither group was paying him any mind. Then, one of the girls in the doorway group starts saying something threatening, and the other is all like, "I'm about to come out as soon as my sister gets here." But the other girl didn't want to wait for that. She just walks inside the store and marches straight over to this girl with dyed blonde hair. I'm like, snap. This is about to go off right here. And honestly, just like that, the two girls start throwing hands at one another in that typical girl fight way, just flailing their hands at one another. Then the girl with blonde hair, she reaches for something in her pants, and although I didn't see it clearly, she swings at the other girl's chest, and it looks a lot like she just punched her. But then as soon as the hit connected, the blonde girl, backed up, then ran off while the other girl just sort of staggered back, then looked down at her chest. I didn't see the blood, not right away, I just heard the screams. What I did see was the girl who had been hit stagger a few steps, then just collapse on the floor. Then when her friends dropped down and rolled her over, that's when I saw the blood on the floor. The EMTs were called, the girl was taken away in an ambulance, and we were all basically tasked with comforting the girl's friends as they were absolutely all shooken up that they just watched their girl get stabbed. Then, about 9 p.m., because we had to empty the store out so the cops could do their thing, I was told I could finish early so I could go home and try and get the whole thing out of my head. But then a half hour after I walked through the front door of my parents' place, I get an Instagram DM from one of the younger coworkers that I was tight with. They ask something like, "You were working second shift tonight, right?" And I respond, "Yeah, some messed up stuff happened." Then the next thing they send me is this long link that had Facebook in there somewhere. I figured it'd just be a sharing of a news story about the whole stabbing thing, but when I opened up the link, it opens up one of those Facebook Live videos, and instantly I knew what I was watching. I knew what I was watching because, 1, I recognized one of the girls from the stabbing at work, and 2, they're saying things like, "That was too much," and "If she killed her, she killed her," and then shrugging it off as if though it was her fault for coming at them and her friend was just defending herself. And then it got way worse. They were literally bragging how they killed someone, and they knew they killed someone too. I mean, I just thought the girl would be taken to the ER or something, but they knew she'd stabbed her in the heart because she aimed to stab her in the heart. We didn't find out until the next day that the girl who got stabbed had died on the way to the hospital. The most effed up thing, though, none of those girls looked older than my little sister, who was a high school freshman at the time. Some of them barely looked like they'd gone through puberty yet. I mean, these were literally kids, literally effing children, and they just killed somebody and were proud of it. I think maybe it was just that they were trying to hide how scared they were, or trying to establish the whole self-defense thing before the cops came looking for them. But my God, seeing that kind of savagery coming out of a kid made my heart break for humanity a little. Those girls had ruined their lives with one little fight, and even worse, they'd literally ended another girl's. Taken her away from her family, friends, all she had going for her in life. All because of one stupid fight.
It was the summer after school had finished, when I finally found myself a decent paying job. It wasn't the finest place to work, but I needed cash, having spent most of it on road trips, where I did nothing but party for days. The shop was small, and it turned out that I was the only staff available for the night shift. I settled down well enough, thanks to my manager Mark. He was a nice guy, always smiling, helpful, and never once had I seen him angry. I remember a week back when a customer started getting heated, some steroid-jacked asshole whose card declined at the till. I tried telling him that I couldn't just let him off this one time, but then he grabbed my collar and started cursing at me. Hearing the commotion, Mark came up to the customer and politely asked him to release me. Naturally, the juicehead didn't, so Mark put a hand on his shoulder, which earned him a punch to the face. A punch like that should have knocked out a scrawny guy like Mark, but instead, blood gushing from his nose, he straightened up and asked the guy to leave, showing no pain or emotion. At that, the customer left quietly, all the while being dumbfounded. Mark nodded at me and went back to his back room, as if nothing had happened. So yeah, aside from the extreme work hours and the occasional asshole, the job wasn't too bad. It was the second week of working there, that Sunday, a slower day than usual. Normally on Sunday nights, there'd be a decent amount of people lining up to buy drinks, except today. The first customer didn't arrive until 2 a.m, just under halfway through my shift. He was strange, to say the least. He wore nothing but an oversized hoodie, which thankfully covered the top half of his legs. He seemed alert. His eyes darted around like a pinball machine. I thought he was high or something, although it wasn't uncommon to see in my shifts. He disappeared somewhere over in the third aisle, before the doors were abruptly barged open again. A second guy came in, wearing a business suit, hair slicked back, and stinking of cologne. A late-night worker like me, but working a job that quadrupled my salary. He ignored me. Clearly I wasn't worth paying attention to, and instead he headed over to the alcohol section. I didn't see the hooded person for a while, so I watched YouTube. Suddenly, there was a crash from outside, like metal slamming against metal. The backroom door opened, and Mark came out. "You should check that out," he said. "I'll work the till for a minute." I went out to investigate, trudging along the parking lot. I saw nothing out of the ordinary. I noticed the overturned bins where a family of foxes were having a feast. I went back to the store. I wasn't paid enough to do anything about it. Taking over from Mark, who went back, I attended to the businessman, who didn't let me scan the products. Instead, he threw a wad of cash, deftly leaving with a bottle of Jameson's. There was another crashing sound, but I ignored it, thinking it was the foxes again. That's when the guy with the hoodie came into sight again, this time with a grin and a large jug of bleach in his hand. Before he could even make it to the counter, he spewed up a tide of vomit, splashing around his bare feet and all over the aisle. He fell unconscious, spilling the bleach. Groaning, I took up a mop and went over to clean up. Pulling the man over to another aisle, I got to work against the stain, grimacing as I recognized the smell of piss. After about 10 minutes, I'd finished up most of the floor. Then I went over to check the bumper clut. Except he wasn't there. I looked around the store for a while, but no, nothing. I went back to my station, where sure enough Mark sat. "Did somebody leave?" I asked. He didn't look too good. "No, nobody's coming on left yet," Mark replied, looking a little puzzled. "You cleaned up the floor?" "Yes." With that, Mark left, and I finished off the next 3 hours of my shift. Occasionally, I'd hear the thumping again, but thought nothing of it. Finally, I was home and went straight to sleep. I awoke to furious knocking on the door. I scrambled to my feet and doubled back when I saw 2 police officers. They introduced themselves and asked if they could interview me. There had been disappearances around the area, and investigations hadn't uncovered anything. They wanted to know if I knew anything about them, and sure enough, things became familiar to me. Missing people like the steroid head a week ago, or the businessman, and the hooded guy. There were other missing customers as well, and eventually, I asked them if they were questioning Mark too. They stopped. "Who's Mark?" they asked. The manager. He works the same shifts as I do." "We've checked the company records. There ain't no Mark on there. Only you." After a while of exchanging words, they put me into a police cruiser and drove to the store. They told me to show them where Mark was. A vague request, and I prayed that he was in today. So far, I knew that I looked like the prime suspect, and only Mark could confirm that I was not involved. I led them to the backroom door and knocked. No response. I knocked a little harder. Still nothing. The police took over, kicking the door down and switching on the light. The horror before us would be something that would never leave my mind. I retched uncontrollably as the stench overpowered me. Stacked up against the far wall were piles of bodies mixed in with each other. Some of them were headless, others missing limbs. The buzz of flies was deafening. The officers cuffed me, quickly whisking me away to the police station. My trial's set to be soon, and as it stands, I'm going to jail. They filed through records, pictures, footage. I was the only one ever seen. But I swear to God, Mark was there. He always was, and I don't care if they call me crazy, because even in the dead of night, in my cell, I can see him in the corner of the room. Hey guys, it's Rye Horror. It seems like many of you guys enjoy my animated stories, but only 27% of you are subscribed. If you want to see this channel hit 10k subs, then please like and subscribe. Now back to the show. As a kid, I loved collecting marbles, and to this day I am fascinated by every object that is spherical. I also used to work a dead-end job at Walmart, as a stocker, and when I needed to, as a cashier. It was Monday, and nearing the end of my workday. Looking at the clock, I sighed as the hours finally hit midnight, so I began closing the tills. The last customer was in the store, but something seemed off. The client was an older man and wore an eye patch, and seemed to look around him every now and then, twitching as he did so. I automatically assumed he was some druggie off the streets, looking for some shelter, but I didn't take any action, since closing wasn't until another half hour or so. Finally, he proceeded to the checkout, a loop of rope in his hand. He looked me right in the eye and asked me a question.
"What happened in the aisle near the gardening section? The floor's wet with oil."
Tentatively, I grabbed the radio and called for the caretaker, the only other guy in the building. But he didn't respond, so I figured the fat bastard had left early. Finishing up the man's purchase, I watched as he left the building, and then I proceeded to where the oil spillage was. As I approached the end of the hall, I saw that there was indeed oil smeared all over the floor. Sighing, I walked over to the stock cupboard to get a mop, opening the door when I was abruptly shoved. The floor was slick with oil and I slipped hard, banging my head against the floor of the cupboard. A wet sensation on my hands. I tried pulling myself up, when I realized I was holding onto the janitor, dead and bloody. He was gagged and missing both eyes. The panic and despair took over me, crawling to the emergency exit. The customer suddenly appeared in front of me holding a baseball bat. And then he proceeded to smash me square in the head. Everything blacked out. Woke up a little later. In front of me was the old man, his eye patch lifted to show a grotesque hole, still bloody and raw. I was strapped to a chair with the very rope I had just sold him. His words came out in a frightening rasp.
"Don't worry, son. I just need to borrow one of your eyes. You see, your friends didn't fit too well."
My heart raced as he brought the knife to my face, inches away from my eyes being forced open by his fingers. Luckily, the security alarm went off, probably due to the emergency exit having been left open for so long. The psycho tried to run away, but the supermarket doors closed automatically. I managed to free myself from the ropes, wriggling hard until they became loose. I rushed to the power panel and turned off the generator. The alarm stopped and the lights in the establishment went out. It was the opportune moment for me to act. It was dark and the man couldn't find his way out, so I followed him silently over the cereal cracks. Eventually, he found the emergency exit and started running towards it. Intercepting him, I tackled him from the side, wrestling with his hands, which held the knife so desperately. I punched him in the gut and he seized up, dropping the weapon. Without thinking, I picked it back up and digging into his only eye, gouged it clean out. The shock was so great that he lost consciousness. I wasn't sure if he was dead, but I pulled his body out of the supermarket and took it to the back, where I threw it into the incinerator, where the garbage was usually tossed into. A few fiery infernos later, the man ceased to exist. I looked at my watch and realized it was time to leave. Shaking, I started to walk home. I needed to calm down and took out my marbles, rolling them in the palm of my hand. It was a soothing sensation and my breathing steadied, except one of these marbles was a lot bigger than the others.